Hi, Ken. Welcome to DC.
It's great to be here. I wish we could be doing this in Shanghai. That'd be much better. Next time.
But I am very excited because I worked for Ken for 7 years at Human Rights Watch, but I no longer work for him. So I'm really excited that I can, finally have the opportunity to say things that I wanted to say to you.
Now you can cross-examine me, exactly.
And ask the questions that I really wanted to know. The book, Righting Wrongs, I read it today.
I can quiz you.
To me, it's less a memoir, more a strategy book. The book is divided into chapters on countries. You talk about your experience, mostly doing advocacy based on the research that Human Rights Watch, as researchers, which is me, have done. Let me just first read the opening of the China chapter. Okay. Then I will have a question. There is no greater threat to the global human rights system today than the Chinese government under Xi Jinping. No government surpasses Beijing in the combination of its repression at home and its determination to silence many critics abroad. And no other government makes so concerted an effort to undermine international human rights standards and the institutions that might and do hold it to account. Dedicating to the task significant proceeds from the world's second largest economy. Beijing's actions, if unchecked, portend a dystopian future in which no one is beyond the reach of Chinese censors, and that the international human rights system is so weakened that it no longer serves as a check on government repression. Because of the stakes, because of the power and influence of the adversary, I immersed myself in our China work, making it a major personal priority. So 2 questions. Why do you say China poses a threat to international human rights like no other country? The second question is because you said that you make it your personal priority to focus on China, and for that reason, in 2022, Human Rights Watch, in its World Report, World Report is an annual report, but every year in the annual report there is a theme essay, and in that year's essay it was on China. And because of that, and you went to Hong Kong to release the report, and then you got deported. So share the experience with the audience.
Okay, that's a lot there. So, well, first, why do I say that China poses the greatest threat to the global human rights system? I don't say that it's the worst abuser, although it's up there. But I don't pretend that it's doing something like what's going on in Gaza or Darfur. So there's widespread violence that is not happening today in China, but it is very repressive, as we all know, and it is also very sensitive to having that be pointed out. And I think there are reasons for that having to do with the lack of elections domestically, the need for international recognition of its legitimacy, and therefore this extraordinary sensitivity to criticism, by individuals, by corporations, and certainly by governments. And so what China has done under Xi Jinping with respect to the global human rights system is 2 things. One, it is actually trying to redefine what human rights are. If you ask most people what human rights are, they will point to these treaties that codify in quite a bit of detail the rights that we're all familiar with. The Chinese government wants to just rip those up and substitute, in essence, a 3-part test. They want to say, is there security, which in the Chinese context basically means repression? Are people happy, which is a meaningless concept when there's no independent polling? And this is the real one, is GDP per capita, so long as they are gradually pulling people out of poverty, making people's lives economically better, they say, we're doing our part. We are fulfilling human rights. Now, that is a radical proposition because human rights are actually about individuals, not about the collective. Human rights are about what the collective owes the individual and what the collective cannot do to the individual. And none of that, the individual isn't in the Chinese definition. The Chinese definition is simply about the totality, about the collective. So it really decimates what human rights are about. It then, to take things a step further, the way human rights are enforced, and I go into this in a lot of detail in the book, is we put pressure on governments, and one of the main fora for that to happen is the United Nations. In particular, the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva. And the Human Rights Council authorizes investigations, it issues reports, it condemns, and the Chinese government would get rid of all of that. They would simply have the UN turn into a nice, pleasant place for conversations where every government talks about how they are protecting human rights in their own unique way, according to their own unique definition. So in essence, there are no more standards, and there is no more pressure. That is the Chinese conception of human rights. And they are very actively pushing this in Geneva and to some extent in New York. Now, they haven't succeeded yet. People are resisting, but no one else who is trying such a radical remake of human rights. And of course, there's nobody else who's willing to put so many resources behind this. I mean, not only things like the Belt and Road Initiative, which passes itself off as a $1 trillion infrastructure development program, but is really a bribery scheme to buy votes at the UN. And nobody else denies market access for people who are have the audacity to criticize the way the government is behaving. So that is why I say it is such a serious threat. Now, you asked about my Hong Kong experience. What I just said was similar to what Sophie and Yaqiu and Maya and various others, the China team, helped me put together for the introduction to the annual Human Rights Watch report in January 2020. Each year, we release that report at a press conference, and we try to choose a relevant locale. And since this year's introduction focused on China, it made sense to try to do the press conference in China, ideally in Beijing or Shanghai, but that was not possible. So we were going to do it in Hong Kong, where I had done press conferences before. It had not been a big deal. So I flew in and didn't get past passport control. They pulled me off to the side, and I was detained for about 5 hours or so. They then put me through this incredibly thorough security check, even though I'd been no place other than detention. And they tried to, rush me onto an airplane back to New York. Now, the Human Rights Watch communications team had not been oblivious to the fact that this might happen, because the Chinese government had already said that they were going to sanction Human Rights Watch. We just didn't know what that meant. So this was, not wholly unexpected. And the communications team said, if you get deported, make sure to do a selfie video that you can post on what was then Twitter. Now, I didn't think I could get away with doing a selfie video while I was in detention. But as they were rushing me to the airplane, I realized I hadn't done it yet. And so I, at that stage, said, I need a minute to myself. And they just backed off. So I pulled out my phone, did the selfie video, one take, that's all I had. And they started pushing me out of the plane. Now, as we're walking down the jetway, I didn't have my regular phone, I had a burner phone. And the burner phone had never linked up, for some reason, to the Hong Kong phone system. I was just using Wi-Fi. And as I'm walking down the jetway, I'm losing the Wi-Fi as I'm trying to send this video back to New York. And so I'm panicking. And I start slow walking down the jetway. And they start pushing me, and I start slowing as slow as I could. And finally, it's sent. And it was, posted on Twitter, and I think retweeted 15,000 times. I spent the entire flight back to New York, emailing with journalists, and it was, it really backfired. And so it kind of served as a, an advertisement for the report. And 2 days later, we issued it at our second choice locale, which was the United Nations in New York, and it was packed. And in fact, a Chinese diplomat even showed up, and they never deigned to do that. But we gave him the microphone and just let him shoot himself in the foot, which he did, because the Hong Kong line had been, this was just an immigration issue, it had nothing to do with the report, nothing political, just a local immigration issue, not Beijing's orders. And the diplomat said, of course we blocked you, you criticized China too much. So that was the end of that. So anyway, that was the story.
So you were banned in China first, in mainland China first, then you were banned in Hong Kong.
Yes.
So what it was.
Yeah. No, I mean,
he got so bad names from so many places. So
yeah, no, I know. China's on the list. Yes, it is. Yeah. But this is only China, and the only other place where I was actually expelled from, because usually they just don't let me in, but was Egypt, when I went to release a report on a huge massacre, and they were not happy with me doing that. So even though I'd done a lot of press conferences in Cairo, I didn't get away with that one.
So in the book, there's a lot of descriptions of you and the world leaders talking about human rights abuses. It's cool. I saw the pictures. When you talk to them, I mean, it's a rare opportunity, right? You have a meeting with them. How do you utilize the time to make your case? You need to do something to make the changes. Yeah. I mean, you can say, shame on you, right? Like, you're a terrible dictator, but that's not effective. So what's your strategy? The book is a strategy. So how do you usually do that when trying to maximize the opportunity?
Yeah, I mean, the book is really a description of the strategies we use. It took me a while to get used to this. I mean, I was intimidated as everybody else when I started meeting with heads of state, but after a while you get used to it. You really have to prepare for these meetings because it's an opportunity, and usually these people are surrounded by sycophants or people are afraid to talk to them candidly. And so I could walk in, I didn't have to worry about them. I could speak very honestly. And so I had to make sure to make the most of these meetings. And so I would really prepare principally with the Human Rights Watch researcher for that country. And I wanted to know, obviously, what do we know about this person's temperament? But what I really wanted to know is how were they going to respond to what I said? Because if I make my case and then they think that they've successfully rebutted it, then we've wasted the meeting. So what I need to do is make my case, have them respond, and then demolish their response. And that's the only way to sort of make these meetings successful. You then, the other big thing you've got to decide is what kind of meeting is this going to be? And you have about, 60 seconds to make that decision. Because you walk in and, judging from very superficial things, the handshake, the smile, whatever it is this going to be a constructive meeting where we can actually have a conversation? Or is this going to be a bash you over the head meeting? And, ideally it's a constructive meeting where we can talk about, okay, these are the things you need to do to address the problem that we just documented. But some are just not like that. They think that they're fine, that they have successfully bludgeoned everybody else who criticizes them. And so in those cases, you have to go in and scare them, basically, and say that, you may think you're getting away with this, but you are completely failing. This report's going to be a disaster for you. It's going to harm your reputation. It's going to have the following diplomatic and economic consequences. This is going to be a mess for you. And just spell it out, And it's not my style to raise my voice. I don't yell. I just keep it very calm, but I'm not the least bit diplomatic. I don't use these stupid euphemisms. I just say, exactly what it is. It's remarkable sometimes how meetings like that work. I tell some stories in the book. One in Libya, where Gaddafi was trying to improve his image and had, kind of gotten rid of his nuclear program and had stopped supporting terrorism, but he needed to clean up his human rights record. And so we negotiated that we would get access to Libyan prisons, and the only condition was that we would then present the findings to him before we released them. So I went to Tripoli and presented the findings, and they started yelling at me. You completely misunderstood. You've been deceived. You're biased. This is so wrong. You can't possibly publish this. And I let them go on for a while, and then I kind of got tired of it. And I said, look, guys, you don't seem to understand. We're doing a press conference in Cairo in a few days. The journalists are going to ask you, what were your meetings like in Tripoli? I can say they were terrible. All they did was yell at us. Or I can say they were productive and they promised the following reforms. Which will it be? Now that completely shut them up. They said, we have to consult with our superiors. And they dismissed us for the day, came back the next day, and it was like a different government. These stacks of folders on the desk and smiles, and these are the prisoners you're concerned about. We gave them a list of 131 prisoners. They were all released within 3 weeks. So sometimes, this works. You have to figure out how to play the meeting. So, it takes a lot of preparation, but it's very worthwhile because being able to kind of just confront the perpetrators head on can make a big difference.
So I've been working on human rights issues in China and the Chinese government's influence around the world for 15 years. I would say the situation has gone only worse and worse. Yeah. Even I think I am a hard worker. When I joined in 2017, the Xinjiang crimes against humanity, the mass incarceration of people in the camps started around at that time. Under the leadership of Sophie Richardson, who was my boss at the time, we published a report on surveillance. We published a report on the camps, all aspects of the Xinjiang issue. There were a lot of attention on this issue. I mean, then later, even the UN, which is usually very timid on China, issued a report saying that what's happening in Xinjiang may constitute crimes against humanity. But 8 years has passed, and the camps were kind of dismantled, but people moved from the camps either to prisons or to factories to work on the forced labor. I have Uyghur friends in America and in other countries, and they're still being pursued by the Chinese government. The families are still being imprisoned in China. So yes, there are a lot of attention, but the reality on the ground has not changed. So how do you respond to that? I mean, you were talking about, I talked to that leader, 100 prisoners got released. Yeah. But it's not the case in China.
Yeah. No, I mean, look, I'm not going to pretend that the repression has gotten better in China. I think Xinjiang is complicated. I mean, you've described it. Xi Jinping himself was very sensitive to what was going on. In other words, there've been Human Rights Watch and Amnesty and others have been reporting on the mass detentions. We knew that to get the UN to do something, we needed an official UN report. And so we started pressing Michelle Bachelet, who at that point was the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. She was the former Chilean president. We pushed her to do a report. She really didn't want to, but gradually agreed and rightly asked for, as she put it, an unfettered investigation. And the Chinese government said, no, you can have a friendly visit. They wanted to just have nice little chit-chats, no investigation. And so she was holding out. We finally persuaded her to publish based on a remote investigation. But at the last minute, Antonio Guterres, Secretary General, who really wanted to go for the Winter Olympics in Beijing, went there and said, I've solved it. They've invited her for a visit, using their language, not hers. And so she was stuck going on this visit, which was a disaster. She was not able to investigate anything. It was a show tour. They used her. But nonetheless, as Yaqiu says, she came back and wrote quite a good report describing possible crimes against humanity. The one problem is that she wrote it, or she published it, 13 minutes before the end of her term. So she basically published and ran. Her successor was Guterres's guy, the current High Commissioner, Volker Turk, who was afraid of his shadow. And he didn't even bother showing up in Beijing, in Geneva until after this next vote. Because what we decided to do is to use the Bachelet report to try to put Xinjiang on the agenda of the UN Human Rights Council. We lost this effort by 2 votes, 19 to 17. So it was very close. To show how much the Chinese government cared, Xi Jinping himself was personally calling heads of state, getting them to vote with China. So which shows that they really do care about their reputation, and the idea that a UN body, their peers, might condemn them is anathema. So I feel that we at least put pressure on them. It's hard to read what's happened since. I mean, as Yaqiu says, the detentions are reduced. Some people have been put into formal prison, given criminal charges, but most people have been, some have been let go, but a lot of people have been put into forced labor. Now, is forced labor better or worse than detention? I don't know. But I think that there is, from their perspective, they feel that they can get away with it. It's more hidden. There aren't these big detention centers that everybody can see. And so in a sense, we've had to change our tactic and now start fighting the forced labor, where actually in this country, we have a very good law. I mean, Sophie was very involved in this, but the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, which creates this presumption against any imports from Xinjiang unless you can prove that it's not the product of forced labor, which you can never do because there's no transparency in the supply chains. So this is, it's a new battle. I would say it's movement sideways, not improvement. But I think we've been able to show that it is possible to put pressure on Beijing. The one footnote I'll add to this is that the UN leadership has been absolutely horrible on this. So when Bachelet put out her report, Guterres literally said, oh, she's independent, she doesn't speak for the UN. Read the Chinese government's response, and we hope we can maintain good relations with Beijing. I mean, it's just hard to imagine somebody more undercutting a report than that. He then, puts his guy, Volker Turk, there. Volker Turk has now been in office 3 years, and he has never once in those 3 years condemned the Chinese government for what it's doing in Xinjiang. And in fact, just a week ago today, he was speaking at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. And so I just asked him point blank in public, will you, here on the record, condemn what China's doing? And he wouldn't do it. It's pathetic. One funny story, I'll stop with this. There's something at the UN called the Universal Periodic Review, which every government, every 4.5 years or so, has to have its human rights record reviewed. Trump, for the first time of anybody, has just refused to do this, but everybody does it. And China came up a couple of years ago. Volker Turk was so afraid that some journalist might ask him a question about China, that day was the day that he suddenly had to take an urgent trip to Liechtenstein. I've been doing human rights work for a long, long time. I've never found the need to go to Liechtenstein. But he had to go that day that China was up. And this just shows how absolutely pathetic the man is. So this is part of the problem we have in trying to get people to focus on China.
Yeah, I've seen those videos of journalists, and also your video of asking a direct question to the High Commissioner, and they try to dodge the question. It's just so pathetic. I love those videos. Now, a question I speak on behalf of the Chinese propaganda is that, the Chinese propaganda often says that Western human rights NGOs only care about minority rights. We talk a lot about Hong Kong. We talk about the Uyghurs, and also at Human Rights Watch, there are quite quantity of research on Tibet. Then the Chinese government, you don't care about them. But look at the majority of Chinese people, the 92% of Chinese people, they are now living such a better life, and blah blah, right? You only care about the minorities. First of all, I want to say, because I work at Human Rights Watch, it's not true. So I want to create a record using the platform. I worked on women's rights issues, which concerns half of the population. I worked on the restrictions on COVID, the human rights abuses associated with that. I worked on human rights defenders who are mainly the majority Han Chinese people. We also went into Hong Kong to release a report on the gender discrimination issue in mainland China. But a question that I have for you as the head of a Human Rights Watch, how do you balance what kind of human rights you choose to report on? Because there's always so much, the Uyghur issue is egregious, right? But it concerns a small population of people. Then they are the majority of people. They have human rights issues, but it's not as terrible as some other issue that affecting a smaller population.
Yeah. No, I mean, Yaqiu, your question is absolutely right. You have to do both. And I mean, of course, you can't ignore the severe persecution of the Uyghurs and the Tibetans. I feel it's very important to take on this claim that, the Chinese Communist Party is making life better for the vast majority, and therefore people are content with the dictatorship of the CCP. And there are, various ways to show that. I mean, you mentioned Hong Kong, and I think it's just worth noting that, the reason that the freedoms in Hong Kong were crushed is that, Xi Jinping can say the Chinese people are happy with the dictatorship of the Chinese Communist Party, but when hundreds of thousands of people take to the street in Hong Kong, one of the few places where anybody has any freedom to say anything, they said the opposite. And that was just intolerable for Xi Jinping. It was a huge embarrassment. And so he shut Hong Kong down. This is also, I should say, it's a threat to Taiwan, and beyond the one China issue. Taiwan also represents an ideological threat because the people clearly don't want CCP dictatorship. And to make matters worse, it's much more successful economically than the CCP has been able to pull off. What we tried to do, and I think the women's rights report you mentioned is a good one. And I think the China team was really very creative in this, is to try to find ways in which the government is just insensitive to the needs of ordinary people. And this can be through, ignoring environmental hazards. It can be, in a sense, I mean, I think COVID was a good example of that. It was really the Chinese government's, covering up of COVID during the first 3 weeks when literally millions of people were going in and out of Wuhan that enabled this to go global. The women's rights report you described is something that was, affects half the population, and was, I think, kind of a very clever report and it showed, how blatant discrimination is. In that sense, mainly in tech firms. The China team, Sophie, while I was there, directed the team, but Yaqiu and others, some anonymous, did a lot of the legwork. And I would step in periodically, one, because it was important, but also two, because we actually tried to protect identities of some of the researchers. But our aim was very much to kind of divide the work. One thing I'll say is that the one reason the Chinese government is different from, say, the old Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union would say, we don't believe in civil and political rights, we believe in economic and social rights. And there was that kind of Cold War ideological divide. That's not the Chinese government line. The Chinese government line, they don't want to talk about economic rights either, because the concept of economic rights, if properly understood, says, are you taking available resources and devoting them to the betterment of the worst off segments of society? And that forces, these embarrassing questions about rural Han Chinese who are constrained by the hukou system or things like that. They don't want those questions. They just want to look at, GDP per capita, the gross figures. And that, which is why they take the individual out of human rights, and that's not what human rights are about.
So you are known for a critic of the Chinese government to the extent of your band, but you're also probably more known for being a critic of Israel. Israel is the best buddy of the US government. China is the biggest enemy of the US government. And for us who work on China for so many years, relying on the US government to put pressure on the Chinese government to change its behavior is such an important strategy. So, but you kind of irked the US government by being such a fierce critic of Israel. So do you worry that you criticize everybody, everything, that it's gonna affect your access to the leaders and whoever that have power to make changes?
Human Rights Watch had a very distinct philosophy on the access question. And I often contrast it with, do you all know the International Committee of the Red Cross, which is the leading humanitarian group in war contexts? And the ICRC has essentially decided to operate confidentially, not to speak out publicly in order to maintain its access, which for it makes sense because it wants to visit prisoners of war, it wants to be able to provide humanitarian services, it needs the physical access to do what it does. And so it silences itself. Human Rights Watch makes the opposite decision. We are willing to sacrifice access if that's what comes from speaking out, because we're not going to sacrifice our voice. Now, there are ways around this. With respect to the investigations, the research, you can use remote monitoring of various forms. Everything from just talking to people who fled, to refugees, to telephoning people on WhatsApp, to using satellite imagery and open source investigation. So there are ways to find out what's happening even if you don't have physical access. When it comes though to speaking with governments, the Chinese government has been odd with Human Rights Watch. They really would meet with us so long as it was not in Beijing. They felt that that was just conferring too much legitimacy on us. But these years, even outside of Beijing, they don't really want to meet with us. And in those circumstances, you speak through the media. They still hear you. It's not the same as sitting down with them. But as long as you can sort of shine an intense spotlight on what they're doing, they'll hear. So that's what you have to do.
So you're Jewish. Yesterday it's Yom Kippur, the holiest holiday in Jewish culture, and I'm Chinese. But I do feel that we share an identity, which is being the traitors of our own people. I've often been called Fanhua, anti-Chinese, and there are so many. Even I don't care. I only focus on China. Even I see so many tweets of or media reports criticizing or smearing you as being anti-Semitic. So first question is, how do you respond to that? And I wanted to learn from you how to respond to my trolls. Second question is more important to me, because I do have a genuine worry that, especially given the climate in the U.S., that my criticism of the Chinese government is going to be weaponized by certain sectors of the U.S. government and the society to weaponize it to, for whatever the purpose it has to, that will have an adverse impact on the Chinese people living in the U.S. This is a genuine worry. So how do you balance that? How to maintain your fact-based criticism of a country at the same time, not having unjustifiable effect on your own people?
Okay, those are two important questions. First on the anti-Semitism point. The way, first of all, it just doesn't get to me because, it's just so ridiculous. It's so clearly being used to just, kind of counter criticism of the Israeli government. So I don't really let that get to me. But what I've been doing these days, in particular, I've written about this quite a bit, is I've gone on the offensive. I really say that, people who use charges of anti-Semitism to deflect criticism of Israel are actually cheapening the concept of anti-Semitism at a point when it's needed. There is a real, genuine, rising threat of anti-Semitism. We saw this just in Manchester yesterday. This is a real issue. But when people hear accusations of anti-Semitism, they just think, oh, there goes Israel again, trying to get rid of criticism. You end up, sacrificing this concept when you need it. And in essence, what they're doing, this is a really cynical thing. They're saying, okay, Jews around the world, we're throwing you under the bus in the name of protecting the Israeli government. And I've just been out there. This is an utterly cynical strategy. And they don't really have an answer to that, because that's exactly what they're doing. In terms of, Yaqiu, your point about how do we avoid, say, criticism of the Chinese government from becoming just, anti-Chinese racism. Partly that's a matter of language. I think it's important not to say, oh, the Chinese did this, but to say it's the CCP or the Chinese government. But also, I really, and this is not just for China, but for every place, I think it's really important not to endorse things like cultural boycotts or academic boycotts, or to blame, the people of a country for what their government does. Because, the people of a country are actually your potential allies. Most change comes from within. So you don't want to alienate the people of the country. You want to make clear that you treat them as distinct from their government. And this comes up today around, should there be a broad cultural boycott of Russia? Should there be boycott of Israeli academic institutions? And I always say no. Targeted sanctions aimed at the military, aimed at government officials, by all means, but not these broad efforts that in essence treat the people as responsible for the government. And I think that, if we really are clear about that, both in the language we use and what we're advocating, that helps not only avoid anti-Chinese sentiment with respect to the people in China, but also for people in the United States.
So, the book was written before Trump got reelected. So a lot of things has happened, especially for people who work in the China field, because we used to, as I said, we used to rely a lot on the US government to play a positive role, pressuring China to make changes. But now the US government is doing more and more acting more and more like the Chinese government. It become really difficult for us to do the work. So, where are the pressure points when the entity that has the biggest power to actually make changes, not so actually make changes in China, just, have some say in altering behavior, is now acting more and more like the authoritarian CCP?
Obviously, it's rare that Trump sees an autocrat he doesn't want to embrace. So that is a problem. There is this antagonism toward China. I don't even trust the antagonism. I get a sense that if Beijing promises to buy more Iowa soybeans, human rights just goes out the window. So, this is a very unreliable ally. And I think we just have to accept that, you can't get much done in Washington at this point. And the cutback on funding has decimated a lot of the Chinese human rights community, which is, a weakness of being too dependent on the US government. What can we do? It is important to note that a lot of other governments play useful roles. On Xinjiang, one thing that we did to try to break through this fear of criticizing China, this fear that if you criticize them, they would retaliate and deny market access, which is what happened to Norway when Liu Xiaobo won the Nobel Peace Prize. It happened to Australia when they had the audacity to urge an independent investigations into the origins of COVID-19. I mean, anybody who says something that China doesn't want, boom, So one thing we did is we began persuading governments that there's safety in numbers. And if they issue a joint statement, China can't retaliate against all of them. And these joint statements, have become quite significant. I mean, the first one I think had about 25 states sign on. Indicative of the fear, there was sort of a tradition that when there is a joint statement, somebody goes to the UN and reads it. Nobody would read it, they were all afraid. They just submitted it in writing. But 3 months later, we got a new statement, and the Brits, went in and read it, and the sky didn't fall in London, it was okay. And these days, these have become more routine. But various governments have played the lead on this. There are about 50 governments that sign on. And Germany, Canada, UK, France, they've all been willing to play leads. And China really cares about that. I mean, they always put out their counter statement, which is signed on by the thugs and dictators of the world. But they they really do care about this repudiation. They worry about their reputation. So I think that that's still worth doing. The thing that I've been trying to push is on Uyghur forced labor. This Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act that exists in the US, which is actually the best out there, this presumption against any import from Xinjiang. Nobody else has done that. And if you go to the European Union, they say, oh, we're against forced labor. We won't import anything made with forced labor. Oh, great, what about this good here? Well, we don't have any evidence of forced labor. And they use sort of ignorance as a defense. They flip the presumption. If they don't know, it comes in. And so while imports from Xinjiang have plummeted in the US, they've skyrocketed in Europe. And so that would be, if the European Union, if the UK, if other major importing governments were to adopt a similar presumption, which is something they could do, that would be very significant. So there really are steps that others can take. It's a matter of pressing them to do that.
I think, after Trump got reelected and then defunded a lot of human rights programs that the US government has been doing, including a China program. So, me and my colleagues in the field has tried to thought.
Well, you were laid off, weren't you?
Yes, so I am unemployed, so that's why I'm doing this.
They pay so well here, yes.
Do you have a job to offer?
I'm unemployed too. And that's why I'm on book tour.
So, then I went to Europe, I went to Brussels and tried to beg them to support us. Then said, oh, but now we have to care about America's threat because given what's going on here, right? And now you're saying that other countries can do more, can band together, do more, but now they have to fend themselves against the US government. Yeah. So, you wrote the book before Trump, and now things have changed so much. And when you no longer work at Human Rights Watch, then there was a New York Times big piece. Oh, you're leaving Human Rights Watch? You were called the godfather of the global human rights movement. So what's your suggestion, advice for the future of our movement, given how things have changed so much?
Yeah. You're right that governments these days are afraid to do anything that Trump doesn't like for fear of a tariff retaliation. I think there will be a limit to that. I think these tariffs will be kind of regularized at some point reasonably soon. One of the things I describe in the book is that this is not the first time when the US government has been on the wrong side of history. If you think back to George W. Bush's global war on terror, here the US was not just embracing autocrats, the US was torturing people in secret CIA detention centers and sending hundreds of people to Guantanamo. So there have been bad periods in the past. On some of the big global efforts we've made, such as establishing the International Criminal Court, the US was against us. The way we were able to win is by building coalitions of governments. And we did this in a series of different situations, but it always had sort of the same pattern, which is put together about 60 governments from all parts of the world that are committed at some level to promoting human rights. And together, they have the moral and political clout to overcome not just Washington, but also typically Moscow and Beijing and other governments that don't want things to happen. And we did this with the treaty to ban anti-personnel landmines, where we shared in a Nobel Peace Prize. We did it with cluster munitions. And the one that really stands out is the International Criminal Court, where, under Clinton, it wasn't even under a Republican administration, the US was adamantly opposed to any court that could even theoretically prosecute an American. And that was just, not our idea of a justice institution. And we put this coalition together, and in the final vote in Rome, the US lost 120-7. They were just shellacked, So it is possible to do this. I take your point that it's harder today when people are afraid of Trump, but there will be, we'll get past this moment with Trump.
So you tweet a lot, right? And sometimes among our staff, we talk about Ken is tweeting a lot. He's reading a lot of articles. Is he actually doing his job? Is he actually reading us? How do you respond to that? Were you actually doing your job, or you just tweeted? He has 600,000 followers, right? Yeah. So, it's something. So the tweeting is working.
First of all, just as I described in the book, I believe in a decentralized and deferential form of management. In other words, I tried to hire people who were super smart, super dedicated, driven, and I let them go. I didn't micromanage. We obviously had very clear principles, a very clear approach. Once people got that, they did their thing. I wanted them coming up with the ideas. I wanted them driving forward. I didn't want them waiting for me to tell them what to do. Now, I obviously was very involved in a lot of the work, and I would represent it in many occasions. I was regularly appearing before governments or the media, but I didn't pretend that I was the researcher. I wasn't looking over people's shoulders. It's just, my conception of the job is you give people ownership of the work, and that's how you get the most out of them. And that is why Human Rights Watch thrived, because we had 500 people who woke up in the morning and asked themselves, how can we make the world better? They weren't just waiting for me to instruct them. On tweeting, the tweeting is not that big a deal, because every morning I wake up and I read the papers. Part of my job is to know what's going on. And as I read through things, I just put together tweets. I have a program, I just plug it in, it spits them out in the course of the day. So it's pretty simple. It's partly just how I keep up, but if I read an article, it's easy to kind of pick up a tweet and just put it out. But it also, I actually like Twitter, X, because I like the discipline of forcing yourself to say, what's this really about in whatever the current character count is. They let you go over, but I try not to go over. So that's hard work to say, okay, in 140 characters, what do you want to say here? And forcing yourself to do that actually makes you a much more effective communicator, because I then get asked these questions by the media and stuff. And if I've already thought through how to say it, that's very helpful. So I didn't think it was not doing my job. It was actually helped me to do my job. Even though I realized the researchers all thought that I was just sitting and tweeting all day.
Well, I think you must be a fast reader, because I know you're a super fast writer. When I was working as a researcher, I thought the China team was supposed to write for you for anything that you say. In China, I have to say that Ken write anything that under his name, he wrote himself. So you must be a super fast reader, super fast writer, besides your actual job. So for the past 15 years, I'm working on human rights issues in China. It has been so draining, because so many abuses, things don't change it for the better. You just read all these things and you just feel like, traumatized. You feel you burn out. And you read so many stories, not just China, and around the world, Syria, Russia, Ukraine. How do you manage that? And how do you relax yourself?
First of all, this may be a fault, but I don't really let it get me down. I know why I'm reading about these terrible things. I'm taking the information, I'm deploying it to put pressure on governments. As I describe in the book, it doesn't always work, but it works a lot. And seeing how, by collecting these stories and deploying them, we are able to move governments, that kept me going. That it was very meaningful. So I didn't let myself get down. I sometimes analogize myself to a doctor where, a doctor's always dealing with illness, but they're doing it, to make people better. And so they don't get down, because they're taking this in and they're trying to improve things. So that's kind of how I addressed the horrible things that we encountered. What do I do to relax? Among other things, I've actually been for 20 years in a book group, a fiction-only book group, because I do enough nonfiction in my day job. And so, that's one thing. And I for many years I ran, I now bicycle. I think through all my articles when I'm biking, my mind is somehow clearer then. And I have friends and family and, do the usual things. So that's what I try to say, stay sane, try.
Thank you so much.
How this kind of digital totalitarianism, digital authoritarianism impact on international human rights, not only in China, but globally?
Mm-hmm. I mean, in terms of AI and digital surveillance, that's a huge issue. And it's obviously an enormous threat. One thing Human Rights Watch did is they were able to get their hands on the handheld device that police were using in Xinjiang to record data on Uyghurs. And I forget how many pages of data, but a lot of pages. And it showed innocuous information that could lead to detention. And so, and you combine that with something like the social credit system, it can be a huge effort to control people, and which clearly implicates human rights. The other thing we have to worry about in AI is, I think this is illustrated in Israel right now, that AI is being weaponized literally. Israel has this program called Lavender, where they're using AI to identify who is Hamas, and an algorithm is basically deciding who gets killed. And there's a lot of work. We could spend all evening talking about that, so I'm not going to go into great length, but just to note that it is a big concern.
Are rights abuses against an individual citizen, are they qualitatively the same as against an entire group? And then also, when we have problems, as in Israel-Palestine, or the Uyghurs and Tibetans, where a lot of those issues are because the Chinese state is afraid of Uyghurs and Tibetans because of their groupness, because of their own national aspirations or stance. Have you thought about this problem of, subnational groups and rights, and the fact that all the players on the board and at the UN are nation states, and the deal that was made to create the United Nations was that, okay, we have a world of nation states, we're going to stay with those nation state borders?
The UN compact, in a sense, accepts, sovereign territory. So there is the right to self-determination that's enshrined in various UN treaties, but the self is never defined. And the assumption is really that the self is the existing nation, not some subnational group. And there's no right answer to that. That's a political question. Where Human Rights Watch comes in is that however that's defined, the people cannot be arbitrarily detained or otherwise facing discrimination or mistreatment because of their ethnicity, because they're members of some disfavored minority. And so I don't really see it as a contradiction. Of course groups can be persecuted. That's the Uyghurs, that's the Tibetans, that's the Palestinians in Gaza. The concept of genocide is taking this to an extreme. But we still are principally concerned with the rights of the individual members of those groups. That they're being persecuted as a group doesn't really change the importance of each individual having their rights. The only place where I think the concept of collective rights makes sense is, for example, if you think about indigenous groups and what is their land. If they may never had a classic office downtown where you can register your land and it's just owned collectively. In situations like that, you do have to think of something like collective ownership, a collective right to the land. But that still doesn't change the right of each individual of that group, not to be killed, not to be detained, not to, the usual things. So, with language, obviously not to have your language suppressed, not to have your traditions suppressed. Everybody should have the right to speak whatever the language they want, to practice whatever religion they want, whatever cultural traditions. Where it becomes a bit more complicated is, when does the state have an obligation to teach in a particular language? Europe has developed minority rights treaties in this area. This is a fuzzier area. And I wouldn't say that the law is super clear. There is a kind of a national interest in having, some unifying language. It shouldn't be at the expense of preventing people from speaking minority languages, but they don't necessarily have to teach in the minority language. So that's where you get tension.
And then a lot of them, when I ask them how about the human rights in China, and then how about all the rule of law and everything, they tell me that China is still such a developing country. The government should focus more on getting people out of poverty than respecting human rights. And I'm just wondering when you face this kind of conversation, how would you approach it? How would you respond to this kind of argument?
In terms of the argument, let's develop first and have rights later. The difficulty is that unaccountable governments, basically governments that don't respect rights, are a very bad bet for economic development. And your Taiwan is a good counterexample. Taiwan now has an accountable government and is far surpassed mainland China in terms of economic development. So the idea that you need a dictatorship to develop, Taiwan is, the refutation of that. But if you look globally, it is rare to find a despot who economically develops. Everybody mentions Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore. He's like the exception that proves the rule. Yes, he wasn't super corrupt. He managed, he's a smart guy. It's a tiny little city-state. He was able to pull it off. But far more often, unaccountable autocrats are people like, Maduro in Venezuela, or, Mugabe in Zimbabwe, or, Sese Seko Mobutu in Zaire. I mean, it's just like these people who were so corrupt and just drove their governments into the ground. And, I often ask people, imagine yourself, you're about to be assigned to a country where you're gonna live, okay? You don't know where that's gonna be. And the only choice you have is to choose a democracy or an autocracy. Which do you want? You would be out of your mind to choose an autocracy. Not simply around personal freedoms, but around economic growth. Because the odds of economic growth succeeding with an autocrat are so much diminished from those with an accountable government. So I just, it's a convenient argument because, yes, the CCP from a very low base caused by its own misgovernance has been able to bring people up to almost the middle income, but not nearly as going as far as other governments right in East Asia that have been much more accountable. So I just don't accept that you need a dictatorship to economically develop. It's usually the opposite.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, our two speakers tonight, and thank you.